All right. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for coming to the session. We have a great panel, and I will briefly introduce the speaker, and then we will discuss some questions, and then we will open up to the floor. So first of all, it's a pleasure to introduce Emmanuelle Javoy. Emmanuelle is the head of social performance and impact measurement at the Symbiotics. Basically, she manages and advises funds that invest in microfinance. She has a very long career on working on microfinance and measuring impact. Before working in Symbiotics, she works in multiple institutions focusing on impact measurement. Then in the order of here, we have Alessandro Maffioli. He's the Chief of Development Effectiveness at the IIC. It's the private sector arm of the Inter-American Development Bank. Alessandro coordinates and oversees all the work on development effectiveness. And before that, actually, has been involved in a large number of impact evaluation in many areas, ranging from agriculture to innovation to entrepreneurship. And he has been involved directly in a number of impact evaluation. Then we have Issa Faye. Issa is the Director of Sector Economics and Development Impact at the IFC. He leads the development and implementation of the IFC AIM, the Anticipated Impact Measurement and Monitoring Tool. And that's an ex-ante assessment tool that the IFC uses to estimate ex-ante impact of their investment, but also their advisory. Before, he worked as a manager at of the research division at the African Development Bank, and he was lecturer in economics at the University of Auvergne in Cergy in France, and also he was a researcher at CNRS. Finally, Miguel Laric is a team leader for growth team and economic development at DFID. And Miguel has worked for more than 12 years as an advisor, working on different topics from economic development, jobs, economic transformation. And he has worked in a number of different countries, from Afghanistan, Nepal, Nigeria. Before DFID, he used to work at the World Bank on urbanization and access to finance, he as a master from Warwick and from Cornell. Welcome. So I want to start the discussion by basically asking you to tell us a little bit more about how in your organization you are measuring impact, and specifically impact on inclusion, and sort of telling us about the positive aspect, the important contribution that you think your methods makes to this work. So we'll start in order from Emmanuelle.
Hello. So at Symbiotics, we measure impact in different ways. Quite a few of them are actually proxies. As you can imagine, being an asset manager, we have a lot of activities that we have to conduct, and relatively limited means to do the impact measurement piece, even though we do that quite strongly. So the different activities we have is, first of all, that for every single investment that we make, before making the investment, we conduct a social rating, which is there to really measure what we consider to be the probability of having a good impact on inclusion. That's made by the analysts that are spending a few days on the ground during a due diligence, asking a lot of questions about the practices of the investees, so the financial institutions in which we aim to invest. So their practices, their products, how inclusive they're likely to be, how accessible they are, what type of audience they actually serve. And so all that information is summarized in the rating that we use as one of the information pieces in the decision-making before the investment. So that's a key element, really, and really informs a lot the process. And then after we've made the investments, we are required in each investee to report a few basic indicators that allow us to measure the type of outreach they really have. And to make reports to investors that are definitely interested in making sure that their investments go to places where usually money doesn't go. So in countries that are usually with relatively low investment levels. And with relatively low financial inclusion, and go to people that are less likely to have received financial services in the past. So typically we measure indeed percentage of women in the borrowers, percentage of people that are living in rural areas in the borrowers, percentage of people that are active in agriculture in the borrowers. All of those clientele we know tend to receive less services, financial services than others. So that we do, and really each investee commits through the contract to provide that type of information on a monthly or annual basis, depending on the indicators. Last is, for some investors, we actually conduct impact surveys, so meaning that we actually go and get information directly from the end clients and summarize that in studies that are really measuring the satisfaction of the clients, but also the type of level of exclusion they were in before receiving the service, and how their situation improved as a result of the service. So, but that's for certain investors that are willing to invest a bit more money in impact measurement. That's, I think, all we do.
Alessandro?
Yeah, so let me just correct you a little bit. IDB Invest. No, we invest a lot of resources in rebranding. So at IDB Invest, former IIC, we have a framework that just focuses on the main characteristics. I think that first, the one thing we want is to have something that was end-to-end. Something that go through the entire transaction process, from the origination effort, structuring, the monitoring of the transaction, the completion, and the final evaluation, the completion report, the final evaluation, and estimation of impact. So in the origination part, what we have what we call strategic selectivity tools. There are tools that in a way indicate what are the main areas or main markets where we should focus our origination effort. And of course, in these parts, we also include several inclusion measurements. For instance, for the agribusiness, we look at what, in terms of what are the countries lagging behind in terms of rural employment of women, or in terms of the rural income, what is the percentage of poor that are concentrated in a certain area, and how they can, where the country in the specific sector is lagging behind. This part of the framework is, in a way, built upon all the work we do as a group in terms of country strategy sector framework. So based on the research we have, what are the major development gap, and where we think that we can make a difference in terms of intervening and making a structural change. Then we will move to the structuring part. The other characteristic of our approach is this portfolio approach. So we have a system of rating our transaction in two dimensions. One is the impact of the transaction, and the other one is the financial contribution to our financial sustainability, the contribution to our financial sustainability. And then we adopt a portfolio approach. We look at transaction in both dimensions and see how, in a way, they help us to comply with our triple bottom line, in a way, and making sure that we can take more risk by having transactions that also allow us to be financially sustainable. In the Delta, that is Development Effectiveness Learning and Assessment Tool, is a scoring system that basically is the estimation of a social and economic rate of return of the transaction, plus a cost, plus a stakeholder analysis, because the idea, we would love to have the ability to monetize all benefits, all social benefits, but as you know, sometimes it's not easy. I can say a big externality is due to reducing inequality in women being discriminated. That could be, in a way, monetized, but it's not easy. So it's difficult to plug into this estimation of the economic rate of return. So we accompany that with a stakeholder analysis. So in the way we then look at transaction, we look at the beneficiary, the indirect and systemic effect they can have, and we look at the stakeholders. So if the transaction is including specific action, specific goal, and specific indicators, that is something that is pretty strong in our system. Then for women, vulnerable population, excluded population can be indigenous people, can be other forms of exclusion, or low income, poor people. Then the transaction, based on the assessment we make and based on a certain threshold that we establish, the transaction receive a higher rating. Then, in a way, saying if you have an economic rate of return of 15%, but you're serving the poor, that 50% is valued more than without that. And then we assess also additionality, so how much we add to the transaction, not only in financial terms, but also in technical assistance. Two characteristics of this system is a decision-making tool. So our development effectiveness officer is part of the team. A likely credit officer, it can stop a transaction at any time. It can call off and say, this is not within our development appetite, we don't want to go for this, and the transaction cannot go ahead. And second is updated in supervision. So once the transaction is approved, of course, we have a result matrix. We track these indicators. For instance, we say that the employment opportunity will be particularly focused on certain poor area where poverty and concentration of poor is very high. So we're going to track the number of people belonging to those areas that are actually employed, and the score can change in supervision. Again, there are corrective measures can be taken. Going towards the closing, we evaluate project with a completion report. Basically, look if the results achieved in terms of direct beneficiary, indirect beneficiary, those may take a little bit more time, are accomplished. And for selected transaction, we deploy impact evaluations, my whole love. So we have a policy that, in a way, guide us in saying, okay, for every single transaction, we have to close this, let's say, accountability exercise, say, yes, we comply with our targets in transaction, but let's try to understand better the attribution part. How much can we really attribute to the investment of this specific client, the effect that we're observing in our tracking system. So that I would say are the main characteristic of our framework related to this, and I can expand more maybe later on this.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Alessandro. I'm not going to try to describe our impact measurement system. I know that we have a lot of colleagues and friends who know about AIM. Let me try to focus more on this inclusion part of the system and what we're trying to do. And before I do that, I want to be a little bit provocative. There are some facts there, some stylized facts. 2.5 billion people lack access to basic sanitation. 2 billion lack access to finance. 1.2 lack access to reliable electricity. 400 million lack access to essential health care. I can go on and go on. When you take women, they're half of the world population. But yet, in terms of economic participation and in terms of job opportunities, they lag behind mine. In terms of entrepreneurships, economic empowerment, employment, leadership, and consumers, right? In the meantime, we have been in the DFI world and the MDBs designing projects, programs for several decades, and the results are there. They're very glaring. It looks like something is not right. There is a disconnect between what we have been doing and what we are achieving on the ground. From my own vantage point, there are 4 reasons for that. The first one is poor targeting. I'm not sure we've been good into targeting those in needs and make sure that we can reach those in needs. That's the first point. Second is that I do believe that inclusion has been treated as just a social and moral imperative. It has not been treated as a business opportunity. Third, the incentive systems that we've been putting in place are not adequate to make sure that we can promote inclusion. And the last, we have not been good in establishing the feedback loop and learning from our operation, as Alessandro was saying, impact evaluation and other tools. We have not been good, at least in the private sector space, in really going back to our operations and correcting and having corrective measures. I think that those are 3 issues I think are very worth spending a moment and discuss. If I come back to the first point, which is the poor targeting, and linking it to the inclusion issue, to my mind, it boils down to 3 facts, to 3 issues. First is that when we design projects, we don't really define the problem we're trying to solve. We have to start with that. We have to start by understanding the problem that we're trying to solve first, and then try to derive a development impact thesis or theory of change that can tell us how we're going to try to solve that problem. Right? And then another thing that we have not been able to really do in a consistent manner is to define what is inclusion. What does it mean? I'm sure if I ask some of you here, we're going to have different definition of inclusion. How can we define it in a consistent manner? What does it mean? Is it a definition that looks at individuals, groups, regions, name it? It's difficult to define inclusion. So we need to start from that, defining what inclusion means. Right? And in terms of putting in place the incentives or not coming back to the economic opportunities and maybe making it like a business, when you look at gender disparity alone, right, it's not really a social or moral imperative. It's more than that. It's an economic necessity. 160 trillion. We have lost 160 trillion in terms of resources because of the disparities in earnings, lifetime earnings between men and women, right? Institutions that have better gender diversity perform better. And when we go to looking into inclusive business and integrating smallholders and micro entrepreneurs into the value chain, we see that this is really a business. There is a 5 trillion worth of business in terms of consumers. The base of the pyramids really represent 5 trillion economics. So this is really a business case. It's not just for our good conscience that we're trying to do inclusion. And we need to make sure that the incentives are there, that we can reward projects that are trying to really seriously addressing those business, inclusion issues. And in terms of the reporting and making sure that we have the feedback loop, it's important that we really do very serious analysis to try to correct our operations. So that brings me to IFC. How do we do that? In IFC, we have the impact measurement system that we're trying to put in place, AIM, that all of you know, and it's trying to provide answers to those issues. And in AIM, we have what we call the sector frameworks. These are the building blocks of the AIM that gives you the rules of the road on how do we assess projects from A to Z. And it starts all the time in all the sector frameworks. You can go online on the IFC website. You will see 25 of them. And we do that for every single sector we're investing in. We try to understand the problem we try to solve and define the theory of change, a development impact thesis. It's clear, so that we know what we're doing and how we're going to do that. That's first. And second, we have developed our team, our inclusive business team has been putting together a definition of inclusion so that we can understand what we're talking about when we discuss inclusion. It's about providing access to goods and services, jobs, and/or assets that are important aspects of well-being to underserved groups or individuals. This includes women, refugees, youth, and other vulnerable groups, right? So we have a definition now in IFC on how do we define inclusion and how do we treat it. That helps us a great deal in terms of assessment. And that's what we can disagree on the definition, but at least it's consistent and we apply it across when we do our assessment, right? And in terms of really treating inclusion as a business opportunity, we have tried to do that by embedding in AIM inclusion. It's embedded in all the sector frameworks you can have in AIM. And when we do the assessment in AIM, you cannot just claim inclusion because you have gender. No. It needs to make sense. Before it becomes a core outcome, it needs really to make sense that we have a problem that we're trying to tackle, and we have intentionally designed the project to address that gap. That's the first thing that we look at. Otherwise, it's not an inclusion claim. It needs to be credible, and then evidence-based and documented. And in terms of incentives, we have built in the AIM system some kind of bonus in the scoring. If you can demonstrate that you are addressing an inclusion challenge and that you're going above and beyond the average to solve that problem, then you have a bonus in terms of inclusion. So we try to make sure that it's built in the process. It's not an artificial bump. It's just that you need to be able to demonstrate and provide evidence that we are tackling this problem and you're doing it in a very significant manner. Last, in terms of addressing those issues, is that we have an end-to-end system, as Alessandro was mentioning. It's linked diagnostic to ex-post evaluation. So we're trying to look at project at all stages of the project cycle. What is important is that in AIM, we have a systematic way of structuring impact assessment along 2 dimensions, the project outcome dimensions and the market dimensions. And on the project outcome dimension, we have different ways of capturing inclusions. One way is through stakeholder analysis, where we map out the beneficiaries and try to see what are the direct and indirect effects we can have. We can have 3, for example, 3 different aspects. When you look at consumers, for example, introducing a new product that helps the underserved access market is a claim for inclusion on our side. Suppliers, integrating smallholders and micro-entrepreneurs to the value chain is another one. And then employees themselves. And there we talk about not only counting jobs, but quality of jobs. How can we improve the conditions, working conditions, and the skills to make sure that they can access markets? That's how we look at it on the project outcome side. You go to market, which is kind of beyond the project and trying to see the catalytic effect. There it's about business practices. It's about business models. What are the business models, the changes we're bringing in behaviors, technologies that will shift the market and provide more access to goods and services or economic opportunities. Also, we use another channel.
Sorry, I want to have this as a conversation.
Right.
So I'm going to go back to some of these points.
Yes, I'm just done. I'm just describing how we capture that on the market side. And another example is enhancing skills to make sure that they can access market opportunities and changes. So just to tell you that in AIM, we're trying to address the issues that are the underlying factors. Why don't we see more inclusion? And our system is trying to capture all that. I can come into the challenges in the second round, if you wish.
Yeah, thanks. Miguel.
Thank you, Leonardo. So given time, I'm just going to say a couple of quick things to add to the conversation. So well, first of all, spot the odd one out. DFID does not invest in companies, unlike everyone else here. We do grant financing for economic development projects. So yes, we do gender disaggregation and beneficiary targeting and all these sorts of things and evaluation. But I think three things that I want to say to just add to the conversation. So one is I've rarely seen ethnicity, identity, and specific those kinds of trickier elements of exclusion very well captured in our approaches. So I think that is an area of real challenge. And of course, norm and behavior change is another one that I think we could get better at. And then let me just say there's 2 recent developments in DFID which I think are relevant. So we're working with CDC on a new approach to directly getting information from beneficiaries using a system by an outfit called Acumen, DB60. Some of you may have heard of them. But essentially, they will directly survey beneficiaries through mobile phone technology. And you can get at granular information about things like job quality, consumption, and so on. So that's a new innovation to directly speak to beneficiaries and hear from them. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we are currently trying to develop for all of our economic development programming, essentially an inclusion analytics to try and cover both the structural elements of inclusion and how we're affecting those and how we understand those, but also the different units of analysis, so firms, supply chains, workers, consumers. And hopefully we will be able to roll this out and add it to our results and monitoring framework. So let me stop there because my voice is going.
Thank you, Miguel. Basically, what I want is sort of building on this discussion, and Issa already start putting forward the challenges in a way why maybe this doesn't work as we wish it would work. What I want to ask you is to reflect on the sort of the challenges that we and as an institution you face in this measuring impact and inclusion. And in particular, I think of two sort of challenges. One is sort of, you were mentioning, there's obviously cost of having better measurement and better, more credible measurement, but then there's a sort of efficiency, credibility trade-off. But there is also a question about trade-off between profitability versus inclusion, and I want to sort of ask you specifically how sort of in the context of your institution you sort of deal with those trade-off, and what are the challenges you think that we face, and also, given we have limited time, maybe to discuss also what are the kind of opportunities going forward. Emmanuelle.
Sorry, you want us to tackle both the opportunities and the challenges at the same time?
Yes, I think we can have time for some questions.
Okay, no problem. So I think in the challenges piece, definitely I think, so in the position where we are at Symbiotics, meaning investing mostly in financial inclusion, so through microfinance institutions or SME banks, one of the challenges we face, I was mentioning, is definitely around the cost it has to collect indicators, to report on the type of inclusion we're able to provide, and also to collect indicators to make our decisions the best ones. And in that sense, I think one of the challenges we face as an industry, as a microfinance industry, is still around this issue about standardization of the indicators that we use. And this is because basically we rely a lot on what the microfinance institutions and the investees are able to report to us in order to be able to do any sort of decision-making based on impact or reporting on the impact. So we really have to rely on them to do a lot of the work so that it can be efficient. And for them to do that piece of the work, meaning really collecting the indicators in their databases on every single transaction, on every single client, we definitely need to make sure that all the investors and DFIs that work with them ask more or less the same question. And so far, we've been able to agree on a few very basic core indicators that everybody asks for. And that's, it's already good. Definitely, we get the number of borrowers, we get the number of female, we get the number of rural clients. But I think that's really the minimum base that we've been able to work on. And it would be extremely good for us to be able to expand that a little bit. And typically, I agree with you. I think if we were able to get a bit more information about the age of the clients or about the type of populations or population groups where they belong, or typically also in our case, whether or not they're first-time borrowers in the system, in the financial system, whether, how many of the clients in a given institution took a loan for the first time in the financial system, so are really included for the first time. Those types of things definitely would be making a lot of sense and would allow us to report much better and to make better decisions. But those, for now, are not fully agreed upon, and so hence we are very reluctant, typically at Symbiotics, to invent new indicators on our own and ask for more, because we know it would probably be counterproductive and make the investees more reluctant to either work with us or just report on those indicators. So I think there is work being done by several entities inside the microfinance sector. One of them is the Social Performance Task Force that I'm now a board member of, representing the investors. And there has already been some work done, and I think we need to push that further. I know IFC, as part of the operating principles for impact management, is also thinking of expanding that list of indicators to a bit more than what we currently have, but remaining pragmatic and manageable in terms of what we ask institutions. So I think for us that's definitely a key thing. And if I'm tackling the opportunities as well, I think one thing that is very important for us, and I'm very hopeful about, actually there are two things. One is we also are using lean data in one of the impact studies we're doing that right now. And so this method of indeed being able to reach out to end borrowers through mobile phones on interviews, so actual conversations, with very standard questions that are simple and that are benchmarked, and that in the end come for a cost for us that is manageable, that we can include in the management fees we charge to some of the investors because they see this as valuable and good value for money, let's say. We think this is an enormous potential because then we really can have points of views of the end beneficiaries on a lot of things related to the service. So how much value it had for them, basically, through various sorts of questions, and being able to compare that value of that specific service to the value of other services they might have received, because they're being asked the exact same question. So this is very, I think, a very interesting thing, and I hope we will be able to compare notes across all the investors or DFIs that may be using that same approach. That's definitely one thing. The other thing is, I think this type of conference is definitely a huge hope also for me, because I think there is a lot of data that exists, notably in the microfinance sector or SME sector, notably the ones coming from the credit bureaus. And I've heard from one research here, analyzing credit bureau information to try and make assumptions and studies about how financial inclusion had helped or not some of the borrowers, depending on the characteristics, etc. And I think a lot more can be done with those data sets. I think in a lot of countries, the credit bureaus, at least the ones that I've been working with, are willing to share information. And you can match the information from the credit bureaus with the information in the microfinance institutions, with potentially lean data or other types of surveys. And I think there you can get an extremely powerful combination to really, in the end, first of all, have a better idea about what's going on in the lives of the people that are using those services that we're trying to extend to them. And second, in very powerful ways for us to be able to match our ratings, the social ratings that we do, with those very precise indicators, meaning improving our capacity to decide on the most valuable investments. And just to finish on your last question, I think this idea of saying that if we have a better social rating that's better, that has been based on more proven data, meaning, checked with those analysis of credit bureau, those analysis of client surveys, etc. If we are able to say that social rating has more power, has more value, it will be easier for us to really also make the case to investors to say, okay, this institution might be a bit more risky on the financial side, but it's so much more powerful on the social side that definitely you need to include a piece of this in your portfolios. And so that's my hope, and that's my hope also that through those conferences we're able to maybe build some research programs that would help us do that, improve the probability, the quality of our social ratings, so that we can make better decisions in the end.
Alessandro.
Yeah, so first point, easy. I agree 100% with Emmanuelle. I think that all the points she touched are extremely valid, standardization, and so on and so forth. So maybe I focus on a couple of things more. One for us, in terms of challenge, so we operate through private sector client. So one of the challenges we pick up is to really transform the conversation. I think Issa was mentioning this, from a conversation of social responsibility to a conversation of core business. Because we think that is something that will make because one of the challenges we have now is to convey, because many of this data, information, and even just convincing them, because we're at the same point. I mean, if we want to classify something as social inclusion as to be a component, a logic, an intervention indicator that we measure, otherwise we won't define that way. So clearly the client has to be on board. And we think that we are very excited about how things are evolving, the impact investing environment, how things are evolving in the general conversation where, you saw the letter by the 200 CEOs. There are a lot of buzz around what is the new purpose of business. So behind the maximizing the shareholder value to maximizing stakeholder values. And that will really resonate with us. And that is the kind of conversation we keep having with our client and say, okay, if you want to be a modern corporation in a modern business market, that is the kind of approach that would be asked more and more from you. Not only from us, it's going to be asked by your employees, your clients, your investors, and so on and so forth. So that is one of the challenges we're really focusing a lot, so transform the conversation from, let's say, a development or sustainability or doing some good conversation to a conversation core business, and how this can be something that is related to your bottom line. And actually what we see in estimating the impact of certain projects on our financial sustainability, we see that there's not always trade-off between maximizing social impact and financial return. I mean, the financial return is much more related to risk element and not always related to the fact that you create an opportunity and access to the definition of use of as inclusion is pretty much in line with what we're using. Second challenge that we see, Issa was sort of mentioning that, is learning from what we do. We measure everything, we evaluate every single project, we have impact evaluation, closing the loop between for us and for our client in terms of we have done this, it works, it doesn't work, should we do it differently? It's easy to say in theory, it requires a big explicit investment in terms of knowledge management, incentive, how you set incentive for your own investment officer, how going to use this knowledge, how do you invest in this kind of knowledge to develop it, how do you invest in terms of developing this kind of hard evidence, and how you disseminate internally, and how you make people pay attention to that and really have a change in the way they originate and structure operation. Another thing that you were mentioning, cost effectiveness, Emmanuelle already said that. And for us, this is also, we think there's I've been working a lot in collecting primary data. And when they ask me, I work a lot in impact evaluation as Leo, they always tell me, they cost a lot of money. I say, the impact evaluation per se doesn't cost money. What costs money is data, okay? And the 80s, 90s, and early 2000 way of collecting data was very expensive. Basically, you have to have somebody going after a beneficiary and asking them information. Things are changing and changing quickly. There's much more data that are produced because a lot of transactions are digitalized. Remember the keynote speaker yesterday about Kenya? Everything now in terms of banking is in a digital record. And so we have a lot of admin and secondary data be generated can be used. And so for us, that has been a huge area of work, how we get in a proper way, access to information in a way that can use that information that is already being generated at a low cost because it's generated for business purpose or administrative purpose, and how we can use that to track the effect we want to track. Example of this is, Pat is here, our leader in that, the work we're doing with Waze in terms of tracking effect on congestion, how you make mobility better in certain areas. Waze is collecting data every second. We have an agreement with them that pass us data with all the confidentiality that is needed so that we can, in a way, monitor our project in transport in terms of the effect they have in decongesting transport, especially in certain area. Satellite data. Again, Patty worked on an evaluation in terms of seeing the impact of rural rehabilitation, the poorest area of Haiti. If I had to do that many years ago, I have to go there and interview people, see what is the income now, and so on and so forth. Now, with night satellite data, all the studies have been done, you can proxy economic activity through those images that are taken basically daily. And satellite data, they're becoming less and less expensive. For instance, in terms of agribusiness, we see a lot of big potential in terms of crop conversion, efficiency, and so on and so forth, in terms of use of water, you name it. So I think that the cost effectiveness, quality cost effectiveness, we are in front of a revolution because data is becoming much more available at a reduced cost. Opportunity for the future, and there we again, in that thing, also following a little bit the Esther Duflo recommendation, this is why we have this impact evaluation policy. We say, with 3 criteria to go in depth to evaluate things. One is sum of many, so we evaluate a couple of transactions representative of some things in our portfolio. So if we do a lot of value chain transactions, we're going to evaluate 2 or 3 in different countries. Innovation, so if the client is adopting a very innovative approach, we can say, wow, if it works, we should spread the news. If it doesn't work, we should say not to use it. Psychometric testing, Rani was studying that. Companies using technology for education, so we are studying those. And the third we call too big not to know. big transaction for which we have a reputational stake, or we really want to know the effect because we think there are, for instance, GDP affecting intervention, the expansion of the Panama Canal. That is something that really, for us, is really catalytic. We really want to know the effect of that. So the rest, monitor as good as you can. So that is all part of the cost effective. You need to evaluate in depth everything, but you need to be strategic in the thing that you go really in depth in evaluating. Big opportunity for the future, my fixation, valuation without DE. How do we give a value money to impact? How we transform the narrative we have in terms of number of people rich, number of poor people included, to something that is translating to a return that we can, in a way, have a conversation on, okay, this is the return for the society in this kind of investment. I know it's hard, but evidence is, we're getting much more evidence on this, and I think that in the long run, there we would need to get, because in a way you want to have an equal conversation between the financial and the impact part. So this is the potential return in terms of financial return of a certain investment, especially for the private sector, and this is the potential return in terms of social and economic return of that investment. When we get there, I think the conversation for impact investors, DFIs and DBs would be much more, I want to simpler, complicated in terms of the assumption, but the way we'll have a unique form to see how we are allocating resources, what is most impactful in terms of impact, in terms of return, sorry. Yes.
Thank you, Alessandro. Issa.
Thank you. No, I couldn't agree more, Alessandro. I think that you touched on the main on the main point, just to echo this need to change the dialogue with the client. I think this is going to be very helpful in terms of collecting more data and more granular data. We still having challenges, for example, to collect some sex disaggregated data in some of our companies. That's because there's lack of awareness of how this data can be useful and how can help them in their strategy and in their businesses. I think that kind of communication and dialogue with clients will be very, very helpful. And then that will also avoid this inclusion washing, which is, okay, it's the flavor of the day. Let's try to put inclusion everywhere in our project. How can we avoid that and make sure that we really address the real issues and try to tackle them? Another point, I think two other things I think are challenging is data limitations, the bias in reporting data, because if you look at individuals and you ask them their socio-economic characteristic, they may not be, they may be reluctant to release some of those data and disclose it. So there's some biases in how much data you can get and how granular you can get in terms of assessing data. And then the last point on the challenges is this issue of definition and how do you make sure that you can take into consideration the fact that inclusion is a global issue, but it's local in essence, because it's context specific. So how can we manage that? That you manage that difference, that fact that it's local in context and it's standardized, as our colleague was saying. That's the difficulty of standardizing, because how would you define it? How would you? What are the metrics that helps you, takes into account the specific features? That's where we have a challenge on how do we define those specific features. I think that's where we need to think a little bit more in trying, because at the end of the day, our system is trying to rank and score projects. It should be comparable. And having local context will make it very challenging. And in terms of the future, I think that my word would be a word of call for collaboration. There is tons of things to do. And I think that IFC alone or IDB would not cut it. I think we need to work together and make sure that we can collaborate efficiently and pushing the needle in some of these things. I mean, one of these things is that we need to invest better in knowing our operation and learning from them and feedback loop and impact evaluation in one of them, doing some of the robust one in the private sector. I know that it's challenging. My colleague Yanni was presenting a paper this morning that was trying to show those challenges. I think it's good that we know what the challenges are, trying to find the methodologies that help us do that. More robust analysis is needed. I think the collecting data, I think we need to do a better job on that. I mean, additional analysis, EPIC model. My colleague Jan also this morning discussed a paper on this model that tried to assess job impact in different countries. I think that we need all of this. And then also a kind of awareness campaign or discussion with the clients on how we can work together with them to better plug this knowledge and data gap. And in terms of definition, I think that we have already started in different ways through the HIPSO group, for example, on harmonizing some of this definition. The 2X challenge in terms of gender, we're trying to work together to make sure that we can have a common definition. I think this needs to be continued. Going beyond the job quantity to quality and trying to capture better the work conditions and will be very helpful. And sex disaggregated data is one that we're trying to push in our house. It's already mandatory. We're trying to have some mandatory gender reporting indicators, but we need to go beyond that. So I'm calling for collaborations and then try to see how we can work with all of you.
I shouldn't be surprised that the panel on inclusion is becoming very inclusive and all aligned. But Miguel,
yeah. So look, I want to give. We need some time for a wider conversation.
Yes.
So I'm going to be really, really quick. I completely agree with everything. This is all really good stuff. In terms of big opportunities, I do think big data, lean data, new data that's coming out, or bringing all of that together could be incredibly powerful. And I guess I wanted to hone in on this issue of an analytical framework for inclusion. So I think to understand these issues properly, we need to understand the macro, the meso, and the micro. So the macro, inequality, elite capture, so broad social exclusion, how are we affecting these through all the work that we do? The meso, the sort of the supply chains, the value chains, and the firms themselves. And then the micro, the beneficiaries, the consumers, the workers. So understanding all of these different dynamics, I think, is important and critical to be able to understand inclusion and to be able to do inclusion in a comprehensive way. And I think if we could have some commonality, just on this issue of standardization, I think there is a limit to standardization. I think what we need is some standardization where it's possible, but consistency. So if we are doing things differently, we know why we're doing them differently. Let me stop there.
Thank you. So we'll open to the floor. Maybe take a few questions. Could you raise your hand? Maybe we just take 3 questions. If you can be brief in your questions so we can have more round. Thanks.
Shall I start? I have the microphone. Yeah? I have a question. So Alessandro Mercury talked about the importance of investing in knowledge management systems to learn from all the evaluations and impact assessments. And I happen to agree with him. And I'd also like to challenge and ask the other panel members what they think of that and how their organizations are trying to learn long-term from all the initiatives in which they're involved. Thank you.
Hi, sorry, I have the microphone. So my name is Sergio Martinez, and I am an alumnus from the Graduate Institute. Yeah, this was a very interesting panel. I think when it comes about the source of evidence, maybe the question is, how will it look in practice, right? Because we talk about impact evaluation, we can talk about quasi-experimental methods, but actually, how do we mainstream evaluation in policy design? And a clear example for this is Basel III and Basel IV conversation, right? So you have these regulations that are holding SME lending, and actually SME banking units lending to small businesses or enterprises are struggling a lot with meeting compliance requirements. But evidence is not there. We design regulation, but we don't have the accurate data collection tools. So the question is, how would it look like in practice, the things of mainstreaming impact evaluation in all of this in order to utilize technology, but actually address technology where it needs to be? Thank you.
Hi. Just a quick question, specifically targeted to Symbiotics. If you could give us some words on how do you see the landscape from private, and especially big private institutional investors sort of demanding more of products like Symbiotics, especially in a emerging world of negative interest rates, cheapening of capital, and how do you see this in the next couple of years, if this is?
I think we have a last one, was down there in the back.
Yes, hi. My name is Thierry Bux from CFEM, Swiss Investment Fund for Emerging Markets in Bern. I have sort of a difficult question regarding to the measurement issue because no one mentioned actually negative impacts. Are you trying within the framework of your own systems also to take into account the potential negative impact of the investments trying to be inclusive? Because we sort of assume that there will be only positive impacts by definition, but especially when some vulnerable groups are targeted, there could be also some indirect negative impacts for them in terms of over-indebtedness, in terms of being made redundant by technological progress. So how do you net it out?
So we just take one more here and then pass.
Thank you very much. Dirk de Velde from ODI. Very great, good panel. I also have a question a bit about impact management, and perhaps you can give us one example where you've learned particular lessons which you have then implemented in your operations, and where you then have had a benefit from it, or where somebody had a benefit from it. And secondly, whether you could also engage with other partners. So when you have learned lessons, those lessons may not be only applicable to yourself. It may also be the case that other actions are needed to improve profitability or performance of your investments or of your particular projects. And so you may also want to then involve other partners, in improving the impact of projects, so that you basically do knowledge management for yourself, but also applicable to others.
Thank you. So we will have now another speaker, so we have 1 minute for each one, so you can pick up one question and go for it. Let's start from Miguel, because he was last area.
Yeah, but I'll be really quick. So a couple of quick things on how DFID learns. I'm going to put my hand up and say I think this is still, as with other members of the panel, one of our biggest challenges, is being able to take lessons from our annual reviews or project completion reports or evaluations and systematically feed them back in to operations and policy. It happens, but it's a very organic process. It's not sufficiently systematic. There's only one other thing I wanted to say. So on this issue of negative impacts, I think that's why we need a really good analytical framework, quite honestly, working at different levels. Because only if you have that do you have a map of what could happen, and then be able to identify when actually what you think happened didn't, or despite the positives, you also had some negatives. And I particularly think understanding spillovers and broader impacts on taxation, norms, and so on is really, really critical. And we were just talking yesterday about how we move away from talking about trickle down. Well, if you don't understand the broad spillovers of economic development, you can easily be charged with believing in trickle down, which is not what we're about.
Issa?
Yeah, just trying to address this negative impacts. I think just to assure that, yes, we do really take into account negative impacts also in AIM as much as we can. And it's not an easy task, but we definitely try to do that whenever we see that. But it needs to be really based on the evidence and data. And one example I can give that we've been dealing with lately was a project in the manufacturing sector. We was trying to create jobs, but it was in a highly protected sectors. And then if we ran the ERR calculation, it was highly negative. And then we could see that the project was not economically viable. And netting out the two, we ended up with a very low rating of project because of that. So we do take into account negative figure.
I'll try to go quickly through a couple of them. So knowledge management, let me say something. So we tried the strategy of basically stalking people, so bombarding them with information. We created a portal, all the lessons learned are there, all the study we have, so they have access, they can search things. And recently we came to the conclusion that it's mainly incentives, so we also training ourselves in terms of behavioral science and see what is that, how we can affect the fact that people, in addition to having this available, they will even make an effort to use them. So now we are using some text mining, machine learning thing to see if we can, once you open a transaction, for instance, an email will be shot to you and say, okay, these are the 3 lessons that we know that should be considered given the type of transaction you're looking at. You can be creative in that, but I think there's a behavioral thing that an investment officer usually is very much focused in love with the transactions he's looking at. He's not very keen to, it was a paper say, he paid to be ignorant. It's better not to know what is going to be the complexity, especially if you're a man on action. You say, I want to act now, and then you come with all these things that make my life complicated, so incentives are great there. Negative impact, the same thing. Well, that's the beauty to estimate an economic social rate of return, because you can net out things. For instance, a similar case, we had a case where working in a protected sector by tariff, you say, okay, that maybe it's beneficial from this side, but this is creating a taxes in terms of an implicit tax from consumer, because the cost of this commodity for the internal consumer is very high. So we definitely net out, add positive effect and net out negative effect. Example of things we consider. An evaluation we done on, for instance, psychometric rating for banks, we found out looked like was a great way to go. We found out that it works only as a complement to a traditional rating system, so you have to be very careful if you use that alone. In agribusiness, we have a lot of lesson in terms of how you have to deal with the client and how the client deal with seasonality. So it is very important the way you structure your operation, what are taken into consideration in terms of dealing with the seasonality, both in terms of the financial and the potential impact. Another recent, very negative lesson we found is a client that was developing a technology-based solution for education and was selling this broadly in one of our member countries. And we find out that they were pretty sure it was working very well, but we found out it works very well when they implement it. The moment they pass it to another implementer, the effect collapses. So that is for us for the client too. For us was say to this country say, okay, hold off. I mean, these things sometimes work, sometimes doesn't. And for the client say, you need to improve the way you assist your client in the implementation, because it is great when you do it, but once you pass it to an external implementer, the effect disappears completely. So those are the kind of things we try to embed in our work in terms of and we fail a lot. And I know that IFC also is pretty transparent in revealing what we're not good at. And I think that is good for especially the impact investor industry. You were talking about also impact washing, and there's a lot of enthusiasm, everything is working, everything is great. Because we are held accountable by our evaluation offices, sometimes most of the time, we have to reveal, every time we have to reveal what is the effect, and sometimes it doesn't work. And so there's a good amount of failures there to learn from.
Thank you, Alessandro.
All right. So maybe the first thing on the knowledge management question, I think one thing that has been very important in the microfinance sector and in this financial inclusion space overall has been those, again, I'm going to mention again, those sector initiatives. And in the case of knowledge management, I think the fact of having CGAP that has been providing, several times now, reviews of impact studies that have been done for financial inclusion, summarizing them, filtering through them, making them understandable by a larger audience. I think that's been an enormous help for the sector to be able to make those messages coming from the research available to a large number of people in an understandable way. I think that's, again, and I hope that continues because it's there is many results coming regularly, and we need to be fed with this in a good way. That's one. On the negative impacts. So definitely, first of all, in the filters that we do through the social ratings, we do review the practices that we think are likely to minimize the negative impacts of getting a loan, essentially, or getting financial services, because you can have. So we tried as much as we can to filter out the institutions that might have really potential negative practices. But, of course, we know it's not necessarily 100% efficient. When we do, typically those impact surveys done by Lean Data do include questions about whether or not the clients had to make significant sacrifices in order to be able to repay those loans, whether they felt that those sacrifices were or not acceptable. So it's also a way for us to gauge which proportion of the clientele in the end ends up feeling stressed by the service, and whether, again, they feel that this is acceptable or not, asking them their opinion. So it's a way for us to gauge the efficiency of our rating. And I guess the last piece on the impact management was that I think the sector of microfinance also has had, learned lesson as a sector. And I think I'm probably using that word very often, but I think really microfinance is a system, and we work as a system. And I think we've learned as a system through crisis. We've had occasions where very bad press has been put out. We've had recent cases again in Cambodia, for instance, of reports claiming that microfinance led to land sales for a lot of people. This pushes us to do research. There's research currently going on to make sure we understand exactly what is the magnitude of those issues so that we collectively learn. And I think that's been, again, a journey as a sector. And the last piece, I guess, on this private institutional investors and this trend that I see here, my impression, and again, I'm really someone that's been focusing a lot on the impact measurement, credit risk analysis of our investments, and not so much about the selling our services to investors. So my word might have, less validity than people that are really more in contact with the investors. But my impression from the recent due diligences that we've had to go through of new investors is that, first of all, definitely we have people coming to us that are not necessarily ones we would have expected to see in the past. So new types of investors interested in that sector, probably some of them interested because there is, in emerging markets, nicer potential returns than in the developed ones. And, it's easy in a way, given the type of returns we have here. So I think there's that's for sure, new types interested by the returns. But what I was very surprised with is I think there has been so much work done in terms of providing information about what is impact, what type of impact you can expect. There's so much resource available that actually we have those new people coming in, very sophisticated. They reach a level very quickly of being able to put quite good questions, really. So again, not new, but not virgin when they reach here. Again, thanks to a lot of the work that's been done in putting out a lot of information and tools.
Okay, thank you very much for this very nice and candid discussion about challenges. I'm encouraged by some of the discussion thinking about the way forward and the call for collaboration. I hope this type of meeting and panel like this actually help fostering collaboration. And thank you very much to all the panelists and the participants for the question.